Welcome in to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Erik Skopil's on the show. I'm Matt Prehm. Welcome to our first podcast of the new year. I guess the second one. We did a post-game podcast of the disastrous Rose Bowl for the Oregon Ducks, but nonetheless, we're now in off-season mode, and that means roster movement, roster projection, and we're going to talk both of those subjects on today's show. Oregon has seen a handful of walk-ons enter the portal. We've seen one scholarship player, to my knowledge, depart since the Rose Bowl. I guess we could count JKS as another one, but that one is so weird.
Yeah, that's probably two though. Let's call it two.
Okay, so we'll call it two. Two scholarship guys have left. A handful of walk-ons have left, and the item to note is Monday the 6th was the last day that a player could notify Oregon they were entering the transfer portal. Now, schools have 48 hours since the announcement or the decision by that player. So we could see a couple more guys trickle in today, January 7th, and tomorrow, Wednesday, January 8th. But no new player can go to the portal and go to Dan Lanning today and say, I want to enter the portal. That is, I guess, the only caveat. And there's always loopholes and caveats. But the only caveat here is if you're a graduate student, you can enter whenever you want. And then I guess 30 days, a 30-day window kicks in if Dan Lanning, for some reason, is no longer the head coach. We don't anticipate that. So basically, in the next 2 days, we're going to have a real good feel for where Oregon is at from within the transfer portal perspective of players departing. Erik, the one guy that, I guess, along with JKS, the other guy that did leave, Ryan Pelham, you noted he was not part of warm-ups during the Rose Bowl. We did see him, I think, a couple days prior to that?
He had been at practice from what we could tell. But, I'll also say on just the practice note, the one at least in Los Angeles, we didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to really take a close look. The one in Eugene, though, I believe he was at that.
So he's the departure. And honestly, he fits in, and so does JKS into this criteria of guys that probably weren't going to have a large impact on next season, at least going into spring football. So if you look at this and say, well, like right now you got 2 days left, and no one outside of maybe Amarion Winston figured to be a regular contributor off the bench. Maybe Jaden Moore a little bit.
Yeah, I'd put him. He's in that fringe, helpful, off the bench kind of pass rusher guy.
So I think that speaks to the culture of Oregon, the opportunity that these guys see at Oregon next year. Because we've seen mass exoduses before at Oregon. We've seen mass exoduses this year from other programs, but at least knock on wood right now, it's a very small number, and I think that's very encouraging.
Yeah, it is encouraging, and I think that's not a surprise to me. That's been the case under Dan since he's been here. I think there was a stat at one point that and obviously this has totally changed, but that none of in the first 2 years, none of his actual prep signees left. They've done a good job of retaining players, and for the most part, the players they do lose, as you said, Matt, they're usually guys who are looking to play a little bit more elsewhere. And I think that was probably the case for both of the two players that we saw leave so far. Pelham was somebody who, I feel awful. His last opportunity was the muff punt against Michigan. I don't think he really ever had a redemption moment that I can think of. So that's rough on him. And Jaron Kiabe Sangapolotelli, I posted kind of something I had heard behind the scenes. And I'll kind of leave that as a VIP nugget if you want to go find it. It's over on the site. But let's just say I think he kind of had always wanted to be at Cal, and that's where he ended up going. And I think he might be the starting quarterback at Cal. That was not something that would have been possible for Oregon. So you kind of look at those two guys, and it doesn't scream, even though I'm sure there are people who dislike Oregon who are listening to this, or the people that dislike Oregon who saw this information come through, that or celebrating the culture problems, the issues they have at Oregon. I don't think that's really what this is at all. And in fact, if there were mass departures and a ton of key players leaving Texas A&M style from a couple of years ago, then we would have already seen or heard that was the case. So early stuff here has been, I think losing JKS, just because I was a big fan of Sungapulatelli's talent, is a bummer. But in the short term, I think it also speaks to Dante Moore, and we can get into kind of what we think the future of this offense will be, because I know that's something we're going to talk about. But I think Moore is somebody that the more we've heard from behind the scenes over the course of the last week, that the more encouraging it's been.
There's been a couple additions since we've been on the show. Barry Alexander has committed to Oregon, a defensive tackle, a 4-star lineman from USC. And then most recently now is Malik Benson, a unranked former number 1 JUCO player in the country, receiver, signed with Alabama out of JUCO ball in 2023, then went to Florida State this past season in 2024. And obviously, if you're a familiar college football fan, you know the struggles the offense had at the quarterback position for the Noles this season. So his numbers were very modest, like 300-something yards and 3 touchdowns or 2 touchdowns. It wasn't anything earth-shattering, but he hit the portal, taking advantage of the Diego Pavia waiver the NCAA granted for former JUCO players getting an extra year of eligibility. He'll be at his 3rd school now in 3 years, but this is a guy that's certainly got a ton of potential, certainly a physical frame that there aren't a lot of players at Oregon like them. And it's a low risk, high reward ad, and it's a 1-year trial. If it doesn't work, he's out of the system and the scholarship rolls over to 2026 anyways. It's worth taking, in my opinion. You've got the story up on the site of just how he fits. How does he fit within the depth chart as well?
I think that's the part that's kind of least clear right now. And you mentioned the stats. He was also Florida State's 2nd leading receiver, even though he had like 316 yards and a touchdown. I think those are his figures last year. So production wasn't great, but that pass offense was about as non-functional of any as you'd see across the country. So I don't know if you should be. Actually, I've seen some people being critical, like, "Oh, this is all he's done." I think that might have been a pass offense that was pretty hard to do a whole lot more in, and obviously the hope is Oregon would be far more productive and far more functional offensively than what Florida State was this past year. But 6'1", 195, a great leaper, probably a little bit of maybe an above average athlete, not a. I don't think he's going to stretch the field maybe necessarily the way an Evan Stewart was this past year, or other players in the past, on the outside. But certainly somebody who can go win a 50-50 ball, and someone you have to be, I think, aware of on the field. And in terms of like the depth chart, like I kind of said to start, it's hard to project right now without knowing what Evan Stewart plans to do, while also kind of juggling like what should the expectations for DeCorian Moore be. The 5-star number 1 rated receiver in the country, who was just I think the MVP at one of these All-American games. So like, do we pencil him in as a starter? Matt, we kind of have had a hard and fast rule of like, don't go pencil in these freshmen right away. But this feels like the unique case where maybe you should. So, we can get through more of the depth chart stuff, because I know I just posted my story up on the site last week, and I've got a lot more thoughts, big picture, just across the board that would be kind of fun to talk out. But receiver is one of the harder ones, because you're going like, okay, is DeCorian going to be a guy right away? What do we do with Evan Stewart? Is he still with the team? Is Justice Lowe, who played a little bit in the slot this last year, capable of filling in for Tez Johnson there? Oh, yeah, and what about some of these younger players that we're really excited about? And then there's still Gary Bryant. So there's a lot of things kind of moving around here. And with Malik entering, it gives you a veteran player and a player who's at least been around the block a time or two, because you look around the rest of this room, and depending upon what happens with Evan's decision, Gary's the only guy who's really played more than a couple of years of college football. So I think from an experience perspective, you like Malik Benson. The physical traits are exciting. The fact that Dan recruited him out of junior college a couple of years ago, all of this kind of put it together and go, okay, it makes sense. But in terms of what the actual fit on field is and how much he plays, I think like there's a lot of people they've added, and I've been like, okay, surefire starter. I don't know if that's necessarily the case here with this one.
I think the thing that looks impressive or interesting to me, Alan Trieu of 24/7 Sports' evaluation coming out of JUCO reminds him of Jamison Williams of the Detroit Lions. That's okay. Yes, please give me more of that.
A fan of him. I like that guy.
Second round projection. Obviously, that's going to take a lot. That's going to take a huge year for Malik Benson to get to that level. But I think more so is this is a guy that's got NFL traits coming out of the JUCO level, and you just need to kind of maximize that and show that consistently. But then uses his explosiveness in the top end to take off the defense, take the top off the defense, and is also a threat to score on short passes. It's not just fast, but a slippery open field runner who can show he can break tackles and has good balance. To me, that seems like similar to what Tez was to Oregon in the short field, but also take the top off the defense. That's kind of what Evan Stewart did. Maybe that's a sign Evan Stewart's leaving. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. Also, maybe it's an idea that, hey, what if Gary, because Gary's been non-committal about what he's going to do.
Sure.
Maybe it's let's get just another veteran piece in here to kind of serve as that third or fourth receiver role on the team that Gary is maybe potentially going to have. And if he doesn't, if he doesn't leave, it just gives you another added piece of another veteran player. And I think it should be interesting to note that I think we're going to see more receivers play this coming season in 2025, because you look at Junior Adams in his first year, and they did a really low rotation of guys, but it was all experienced in 2022. It was Chris Hudson, it was Troy Franklin, Dante Thornton really struggled to get in there. Chase Cota was an experienced player at the receiver position, but they really kind of leaned on just those three guys. And then Dante was kind of the fourth that got into the mix a little bit. And then in 2023, it was very similar. It was Troy, it was Tez, it was Trayshawn, and it was Gary. And that season, like those are all veteran players. Those are all guys that, had experience, whether in the system or at the collegiate level. Everyone else behind them was young. It was really hard to crack the group. And then this year it was very similar. You basically swapped out Evan Stewart for Troy Franklin, and it was the same group. And Gary came back and had a little bit of a role. Justice pushed his way in because of injury and because of suspension. But next year, you don't have all those veteran pieces. And I think we're going to see some younger guys get into the mix a little bit early on. And maybe that number, kind of like in the NCAA tournament in college basketball, where college coaches play 10, 11 guys in the month of November and December. And then by February or March, that number is cut down to 8 or 7. Maybe we see a situation where in the month of September, maybe part of October, Oregon's rotating 6 or 7 guys at the receiver spot. But then towards the end, that gets cut down to 4 or 5. I think that has a high probability. And so you're just adding pieces to give you more options, give you different options, and at the same time adding experience. So it's an interesting one. And we'll get to the depth chart here in a little bit, because we've also got to talk about Mekhi Hughes, a Tulane transfer, a running back, a 4-star guy, top 10 player at the position in the transfer portal right now, a very productive player. He was the other official visitor this past weekend with Benson. He is not committed yet, but I placed a crystal ball. Matt Zenitz has placed a crystal ball. All signs are pointing towards this portal addition, and it's an important one because Jordan James is now off to the NFL.
Yeah, we should know. Yeah, I think listeners have probably seen it, but Jordan James, Derek Harmon, Tez Johnson, all officially, heading to the NFL. I don't know really if Tez had a decision to make or not, considering I think his 5-year window was closed, including the 2020 COVID season. But, losing Jordan, if there wasn't a clear and direct path, would have been concerning, to say the least, if you look around the roster and go like, who would have been the replacement? Would it be Jaden Lamar, who's played the most of that group? Would it be a Dewan Riggs, who had a couple nice moments late in the season, but let's be frank, he wasn't playing quality competition, and I don't know if we could really draw a huge amount of conclusions from that. Jay Harris is still with the program. They signed a couple of guys. No, Whittington hasn't been quite as committal about it being his final season, so maybe there's a possibility he could come back. But none of those players, if you run through it, are the types of running backs you need to try to play for what this program wants to play for every season. I mean, I'm just trying to be objective there. Unless there's a huge season of off-season development, which sometimes you do see, none of those guys were going to be there. Would have taken kind of an outlier of off-season. So Hughes is somebody, assuming he does end up at Oregon, that is an incredibly productive player. Reminds me a lot of Jordan James, frankly, in terms of the size, both about 5'10", 210 pounds. And the thing that really stood out to me watching Mekhi Hughes, who we should note, Naeem Offord's brother as well. I don't know if that's been widely publicized. I think it has. I'm kind of joking because I think that's basically been everybody's first take. But the thing that kind of stood out to me with Hughes is 7 runs of 30 yards or more last year. That was 11th nationally. Matt, do you remember how many runs Oregon had of 30 yards or more this season by a running back?
Ooh. 4?
2?
Oh, jeez. I mean, I was going low end, and I was still twice as many.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that was the thing, is they just didn't really have any explosive run game. And going through the rush stats in general, like, I thought Jordan James, I'm not trying to take anything away from him because I love what he produced and the way he ran, but just not a home run hitter, just not a guy who really broke the deep one. And, not that really Bucky Irving necessarily had been that before, because Bucky, who's having an unbelievable NFL season, so much fun to watch, showing everybody at the NFL level what we saw at Oregon for those 2 seasons, also wasn't like a true breakaway, speed finish kind of guy. Mekhi Hughes might be the most gifted kind of open field runner Oregon, assuming he signs, will have had in a minute, in terms of a guy who can connect and finish the long play. So that part to me kind of stood out, and especially watching him on film, like, he just has a little bit better finishing speed, a little bit of a different top gear maybe than a couple of the guys they've been relying on the past couple seasons. And now it'll be kind of come down to Will Stein and company to figure out the way to take advantage of that. But if this is a guy they add, I think it's a huge addition from a stability perspective. It's a really young room, but then also, as I was just kind of alluding to, a guy who was PFF's number 3 graded running back in the country this year, just behind Ashton Genty and Scadaboo. So a player who I think everybody should be really excited if this comes together.
Yeah, this is an addition where when Bucky came, that was a big deal because it was hey, this guy has performed well and kind of like shared duties or kind of co-starter type role, but it wasn't viewed as like this was one of the best running backs in college football. He was a young, promising guy, but needed to kind of maximize and fulfill potential into actual production, on-field production. Mekhi Hughes is arguably is it overreaching to say top 5 returning running back in college football next season? Like,
PFF would say he's their best returning running back. I don't know if people don't love those grades, but he would be the best returner next year. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're adding a guy that's a proven commodity at the group of 5 level. We've seen group of 5 players go up to Power 5 and perform really well. Tez Johnson being one at Oregon, who turned into basically, if it wasn't just a monstrous year at receiver and he didn't get hurt, maybe an All-American candidacy kind of year from what Oregon had. Certainly set school records last year as a first-year player at Oregon. So this is a dude that he's big. I think he's heavier than Jordan James, or right about the same.
It's the same weight, both 210.
Okay. But your point of breakaway speed and having that home run threat, and it's a productive player. It's, to be honest too, it's also probably a 1-year deal. Like, if he has the year that he thinks he should have, if he has the year Oregon thinks he should have, and if the Ducks are successful over the course of a 13, 14, 15, 16 game schedule, he's probably one and done and off to the NFL, a la Christian Gonzalez, or, when he transferred from Colorado to play corner at Oregon as a junior a couple of years ago. This is probably a similar nature of, if you do what you're supposed to do, you're here 1 year and you're off to the NFL. That's the type of guy that they're getting. I think that's important, and it provides a little bit of stability post James, and also regardless of what Whittington does. I think obviously Oregon would like Whittington back next season, because then after that the depth chart kind of gets a little weird if Whittington's not in the rotation. But it gives you a bell cow that James served as last season. It gives you a home run hit if he commits to Oregon. We should know he hasn't come here yet. He hasn't announced he's committed. He's kind of acting like he is, because I think he will be. But this could be one of the bigger portal ads for any school on the offensive side of the ball, from just an instant impact type guy at the skill position groups, if it comes to fruition for Oregon.
And I think we need to frame it around this as well. And this will let us kind of talk about some of the other positions on this offense. I know we've already done receiver a little bit, but think about just the questions people have at quarterback with this team. I'm not saying they're necessarily valid in terms of questioning if Oregon has a starting caliber player, but you've gone from 3 years with portal players that had, two of the most experienced, I think the two most experienced quarterbacks in college football history were the guys running your offense the last 3 years. And now you're going to be leaning on most likely Dante Moore. And that's where I think it was really imperative to find a running back like this, just somebody that you could lean on, right? Because there's going to be presumably with a young quarterback, some down days, some days where it's not clicking, where the opposition finds some things maybe schematically that he struggles to fix and work through. And so whether that's Dante Moore or Austin Novosad, and I think most people think it's Dante Moore. That's certainly been kind of the name coming out of Oregon's camp to a certain degree, but you're going to want somebody like this to rely on for this offense. You're going to want an experienced, a reliable running back to kind of build off of, because there might be Saturdays where it doesn't look great in the pass offense. And now you have at least a counter to that, because let's be real. If you didn't have a running back of this caliber, or the run game was, an issue, like it kind of was at times this year, you end up looking at where this offense finished statistically. It was like a top 15 pass offense. It was like a top 25 overall offense. It was like a top 60 rush offense. So they need some stability at this position. I think this is a really significant add. And then I think where you have to start thinking next is, and maybe this is the natural progression, Matt, unless you had more on Hughes that you wanted to hit really quick.
Let's go for it.
It's just like, let's look at this offense next year and what do we think it can be? And I want to start with Dante Moore, because I just did my two deep. I have more over Novosad. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the other case, because I thought in the spring we saw a really impressive array of talent from both those quarterbacks. But there's one of the things that stood out from Malik Benson today is he told ESPN part of the reason he committed to Oregon was to play with this young, exciting quarterback named Dante Moore. That was like a part of his decision-making. And I thought that was interesting. And then you go back and you see Tez Johnson's comments down in Pasadena, where they're saying I think he's capable of being a Heisman finalist. And, part of that is a guy caping for a young player and kind of looking out for a teammate. I don't know if that's necessary. I wouldn't put that as the expectation going into the year, but I also know that
history says it is.
History says at Oregon, if you take a portal player, you're a Heisman finalist. That's the rules. That's how it works. Maybe it takes 2 years.
Also Will Stein.
Will Stein. But I was gonna say maybe it takes 2 years, because technically it took Bo a second year before he was
Sure.
such a late bloomer. No, but I also know you spoke to Will Stein about these two young guys, and you heard positive things too. So you can get into some of what you and Will talked about. But I just think when you're forward thinking and looking at Oregon, and I've seen some of these way too early top 25s that still have Oregon as a top 4, top 5 team next year. And people are kind of skeptical of that. I think I understand the skepticism, considering all Oregon is losing, but I think there's a chance this offense still is pretty damn dynamic next year. And whether it's Dante or Austin leading the show, there's not a lack of talent at quarterback here. And there's a reason a player like Jaren Kiave-Sangapulatelli, who I know Cal probably was where his heart was maybe all along, but where he arrived and looked at the depth chart and thought, well, there's no way I'm starting over one of those guys.
Yeah, Stein, I thought the thing that took away from me was, and I didn't really give him – actually, I did. I asked him about Dante Moore and Novosad, and then I asked why did you sign 2 quarterbacks? Excuse me. So he had an opportunity to talk about all 4 guys when JKS was still part of the team, along with Keely Smith Jr. But the thing he said about Austin Novosad and Dante Moore was he's like, they're going to have a really good battle for the job. And whether that was just me reading too much into it, whether that was him letting it slip, but I read it as like it's those 2 guys. Luke Moga, the 2 now 1 freshman, true freshman quarterback probably aren't going to be in the picture to win the job. They'll be given a chance, no doubt.
Sure.
No coach is ever going to say that, but I think Oregon is kind of banking on the fact that whoever emerges as QB1 next year will be between Austin Novosad and Dante Moore. I should note that an interesting layer here is someone else brought this to my attention. All season, Oregon rotated a small group of receivers. We talked about that. And then the younger guys basically took all the second team, all the third team reps. A lot of the guys that are going to play at the receiver position this coming year with Dante Moore and Austin Novosad. Like, there's going to be some built-in chemistry already there with this younger group because they've practiced together for a year. That could help ease some things in a little bit. But nonetheless, Stein was very high on both guys. He was very he gave some really good things about Austin Novosad, just his IQ and understanding of the offense. And probably that's where his path is to get on the field above Dante Moore, because I think Dante Moore's got the physical traits over Austin Novosad. But if Novosad's if he's gonna win the job, it's because he probably can process things quicker, or he can figure out the offense better than Dante Moore. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Dante Moore is going to be the starter. I think he's going to have no issues understanding the playbook. But Stein was just very high on the IQ and the physical traits too. But Novosad, he said he knows the system completely. And we should note, he will be in the system for 3 years. This will be Dante Moore will have completed just his first year post spring ball whenever that happens for Oregon. So Novosad's got more experience. I think Moore has more of the physical traits that you want at the quarterback position, and he's got the experience. He played at the collegiate level already at UCLA 1 year. I think that will factor in as well. I'm with you. I think Dante Moore is going to be the guy, but nonetheless, they're going to have options. They're going to have some good options, and it's probably time for the Lanning era to kind of usher in a younger guy and stop this portal cycle of 2 years in a row, 3 years, twice in 3 years. Running back, I'm curious here, your depth chart of, we know James is out now. Whittington probably, does he slide in for now, or do we just keep...
We're under the impression Mekhi Hughes is on the team, and so he's your running back. And to me, then it becomes who's the number 2. And I'm just, the article I did, which I did on Thursday of last week, was under the presumption that everybody who hadn't announced was returning. And so I think, if I'm being real, I expect Noah Whittington to not be on the team next year. That was certainly where his head was at going into the season. And you understand it. I mean, he's played like 5+ years, I think 5 years of college football already. For him, and had that injury in there in the middle. For him, it makes sense to probably try to go do something professionally. Then it becomes a question of who the number 2 is, because let's be real, this has never been a one running back operation. This is not what Boise State or Arizona State have done in the last couple of years here with these elite running backs, where they just give these guys the ball every down. So there's going to be another running back that needs to be kind of accompanying Hughes, and I will be very curious to see who that is. Riggs would just be the player that I'm most intrigued by from that group. But we're probably in agreement that maybe we're not sure what Jay Harris's plans are. I'm kind of surprised his name hasn't popped up in the portal. I think they maybe kind of mishandled his redshirt year, because he had a year and he played 5 games. So I wonder how that impacts kind of where his head is at. But to me, my question at this point is just who's the second running back?
I am all in on it being DeJuan Riggs. Jaden Lamar has had his opportunities to kind of cement himself. I think it was notable in other moments where they chose to play late in the year, Riggs over Lamar in short spurts, maybe reading way too much into it. But I think Riggs is just a better player. And it wouldn't surprise me if he's 2, Lamar is 3. I don't anticipate Jay Harris being on the team. Maybe that's me kind of speaking the part we kind of try to avoid out in public, speculating on guys, but he could have redshirted last season, didn't, whether that was his choice or whether that was a mistake by Oregon's roster management of playing him in 5 games in the regular season beyond the redshirt rule. And I just, quite frankly, it was a weird take. I know there was a lot of excitement without seeing him perform at this level. When he arrived, different running back coach brought him in. Maybe he sticks through it, but I don't have Jay Harris being higher than 3rd or 4th, and realistically 4th on the depth chart right now. And maybe he's cool with that. Maybe he's fine with that. And that's totally fine if he is. But I just don't think he's going to have this marquee year or career that some people thought he was going to maybe have at Oregon. And I guess the other one, if there is a year where a true freshman could get some kind of run, didn't see one in 24, didn't see one in 23.
We saw true freshman in 23.
Who?
Jaden and Dante both played enough to not redshirt. They didn't
but
play
I
a
was
ton.
talking more of like what Jordan James had from a clear defined role, and where James was like, hey, you're going to get 6 or 7 guys, 6 or 7 carries a game, and anytime it's a short yardage goal line situation, you're coming in. I don't think Jaden Lamar had that, did he? In 2023?
Well, he was the number 3 guy once Noah went down, so he ended up kind of getting in a little bit. He and Dante did, but I mean, it was. I'm not totally disagreeing. I'm just saying they actually did play 2 guys that year, which was weird.
Yeah, but I actually think there's an opportunity for De'Aaron Hill to get on the field because of his explosiveness and his 2-way ability. Kind of reminds me of Whittington, especially if Whittington leaves. Whittington leaves, I think it's guaranteed one of the true freshmen, Jordan Davison or Hill, will play some kind of role along with Jaden Lamar and DeJuan Riggs and Mekhi Hughes if he comes. Receiver, another one. Do we want to go too much into this?
We kind of touched it with the Malik Benson stuff. I mean, I'll read what I've got here for my too early, too deep, which is I actually do have DeCorian Moore starting at one outside receiver spot. Assuming Evan Stewart is back, I have him at the other, and then Justice Slow at slot. Benson, by the way, his addition came following this 2 deep I put together. I would probably slot him as like an or next to Evan Stewart, or maybe he's a slot starter. It's just he played I think about 340 of his 400 something snaps on the outside at Florida State. So it seems like that's where the fit makes the most sense. And as well, just based upon kind of the player profile. So that's kind of where I'm at there. The thing that I'm curious on is like what happens with Gary Bryant. A, is he on the team? B, if he is, does he see the field more? Like, it was a weird year this year where there were times where he was available and other receivers weren't, and he still didn't really play a lot from scrimmage. It was primarily just kind of the punt return replacement for Tez. I think Kyler Casper is a sneaky wild card here. People forget.
What do we have here? What can he do?
Well, I even forgot a little bit. Justice Lowe, Kyler Casper played far more snaps than Justice Lowe before Kyler Casper got hurt. He was their number 4 receiver before the injury. Clearly there's something there. He's never really been able to turn that into any sort of on-field production that's been overly impressive, but it's a guy the staff clearly likes. He was one of the big names coming out of spring that they were talking about. Jeremiah McClellan's another name that I'd throw out there. And then people will want to know what's going to happen with Jerion Dickey. I'm kind of just done trying to figure this one out, other than he's a really, really talented player that the staff just hasn't been able to figure out a way to utilize, or maybe he's not giving them an opportunity to utilize him for whatever reason. So he's one that we'll get a ton of questions about. But at this point with him, I don't have him on my 2 deep. That's not to say it would be a surprise if he was there. It wouldn't be like with his physical tools, like maybe year 3 it all clicks and he's a starter. That would really surprise me, but like that's maybe a possible outcome. But he's just somebody I'm just kind of not sure where to place him. So I didn't even include him in the 2 deep. So that, there's a lot of names, Matt, and you kind of mentioned it earlier. Maybe they rotate more. I'll kind of believe it when I see it, because that was something that I asked Will Stein about in the spring. I was like, could you guys play 6 or 7 guys? And he was like, yeah, we want to incorporate. Yeah. And then they played 4. And they just basically only played 4 guys all season. And they rotated who those 4 guys were at times based upon injuries and stuff. But like, even remember like when Trayshawn was serving in suspension, they really only played 3 receivers. And it was kind of just only Justice, Evan, and Tez. And then Tez goes down. It was kind of almost, again, just 3 receivers, with kind of Gary maybe being kind of involved a little bit more. So I kind of stick with just like it'll probably be just like four guys again, because that seems like what it's been. But they certainly have a lot of names to consider when you're trying to figure out like how this could all work.
Spring game is gonna be fun.
Yeah,
we're gonna get a clear indicator of kind of what they do, who they play with, what are the combinations, and it's going to be an interesting group depending on the last couple of days of portal decisions. Evan Stewart's decision hinges a lot on, I think, what Oregon does in the portal from additional standpoint, and also kind of what they look like next season. I will note, Will Stein said that look, a little bit of this, I think, is kind of what we talked about with the Dante Moore stuff of hyping up your guy, building some confidence, whether it's through media or not. But Will Stein did say to me that Justice Lowe is a future NFL guy. Like that's where they feel his potential goes. And he said he more than held his own in the slot and on the outside, and his position versatility next year, he can play all over the place. Does that mean he's the number 1 receiver next year? No, it does not. But that's kind of where their eyes are. I don't think coaches go out and say those things as often as players do, teammates do. And when they do, whether it's true or not, that adds a little bit of just kick to me of, wow, that's something to note on. Like, they're going out there and saying that, guys typically don't hype players up like that. It's something to kick down the curve, down the road when spring ball gets here. Tight end, a new group, a lot of new faces. It's going to be completely changed over from the 2021 season now with Herbert and Ferguson gone. Those 2 guys, 2 most experienced players. Herbert was here in 2019, and Ferguson, a 4-year starter for the Ducks. And it's going to be a new room. And the leadership of it, there's going to be big. Who steps up in that role? Is Kenyon Sadiq ready for it? Ferguson, a lot of his interviews the last 2 years has always been around the standard of the position and making sure he leaves an imprint on the younger guys to know this is how we do things. This is what's expected of you. Everyone's been high on Kenyon Sadiq, but he can't do it all, and the options behind him are pretty unproven.
Yeah, I think it's a good point in the leadership part, because that's the thing that kind of gets overlooked. But Ferg and Herbert were like 2 of the offensive leaders for 2 or 3 seasons now, right? For a while here, and guys that everybody leaned on, and certainly guys that Kenyon Sadiq leaned on. Is Kenyon now in his 3rd season ready for that part? I think that's something that could be a question. He's a pretty soft-spoken guy. What I'm not concerned about is the on-field part, where I thought he took a huge step forward as a blocker. That was one of the knocks on him, just based on size. It's like, he's 6'3", 245. Can he be, or 235? Can he be, an elite blocker? And guess what? PFF had him as head and shoulders above Ferguson and Herbert this year blocking in all facets. Like, had him as one of the better blockers for the position in the conference. So that part eases some concerns, because I think you could have convinced yourself with that size and just kind of the athleticism and stuff, like, well, he's just the Brock Bowers player that Will Stein made that comp last spring. He's just kind of that sort of a player. But in line, I think he's a little bit more capable than maybe we gave him credit for. The other thing that gives me some kind of hope here and encouragement is I really like Jamari Johnson, the Louisville transfer. He is bigger, 6'5", I think close to 260 pounds. He's also extremely athletic. Like, I think while Oregon might have lost some great leadership, and I think Ferg's going to have an NFL career that will probably probably last longer than people expect. They're undoubtedly more explosive, a little bit more athletic, I think, between Sadiq and Johnson, just in terms of the types of players both of these guys can be in the open field. And obviously we saw Sadiq do some of that towards the end of the season. So I'm excited to see what Will Stein does with this tight end room. It's a kind of a different caliber of athlete. How Sadiq was kind of supposed to be this Swiss Army knife this last year. I don't know if they ever really found the best way to use him in some regard in terms of taking advantage of all of that stuff. Well, this year, I figure he's going to be a fixture here. Shoot, like you might want to include him in the receiver depth chart. Like, I wouldn't be surprised to see him, out there as a receiver with Johnson or somebody else, kind of as the inline player.
Not necessarily Tyler Warren effect. Not necessarily throwing passes, but he's going to be thrown all over the place.
Absolutely. No, yeah, good point. Yeah, exactly. So I like both those guys. The issue at tight end is there's just not much after that at all. Like Sully Apaga, who's a player who played the first, I think, 11 games, 12 games of the season, was the only freshman to do that this year. He suffered a somewhat significant knee injury, is my understanding. One that we saw kind of take place maybe, I don't know, end of November, mid-November or something like that. I don't know exactly what that's going to do for him, but that probably makes me a little less confident in what you can expect to get out of him. AJ Pugliano was dealing with an injury all year himself. And, you did sign Vander Plug, who we saw him. He's already been on campus. We saw him up close and personal. That's a big physical guy. It looks like he could, ready to compete. Maybe you need to rely on him a little bit more. So I think you really like the top two guys you have at tight end. And you like the promise of Saliapaga and Plug and Pugliano, but you'll need one of those guys to take a step forward. And there's, from an injury perspective, at least reason to be kind of, I don't want to say skeptical, but just kind of wonder exactly what those guys could offer.
I wonder how much 12 personnel or 13 personnel we're going to see next season. I wonder if some of that was dictated the last couple of years at Oregon by the number of talented tight ends that they had. Like in 2022, they had Cam, they had Ferguson, they had Herbert. Did they have Maliki Madabau too that season?
Maliki was there in 21 and 22.
Yeah, so like in 22, they had like 4 dudes. And I understand Dillingham was the OC then. But they had like 4 legit Power 5 tight ends on its roster. And then in 2023, they brought in Casey Kelly when Cam and Maliki left. And that gave them a third guy plus Ferguson, plus Kenyon Sadiq's addition, brought it back to 4. This year they operated with 3. We still saw quite a bit of 12 personnel, a little bit of 13 personnel. Mm-hmm. But next year there's a lot of unknown, and the body types you talked about. The athleticism is going to improve, but do we see more, one tight end sets? Do we see them flex Kenyon Sadiq out into the slot more often, and he plays consistently? And Jamari Johnson is the inline blocking tight end. I'm curious if it's going to impact there. All right, offensive line, last bit of group here. This is one where, again, there's going to be some rotation changes here. Nishad Strother has graduated, is out. Marcus Harper has graduated. He is also out. We're waiting on the status of Josh Connerly Jr. at left tackle. Does he go pro? Does he come back? Johnny Cornelius at right tackle. He is out of eligibility. He moves on. Matthew Bedford is injured from this season. He was a senior. Does he get the medical hardship back? I think he will. I think he should. How does he factor in here? George Silva, an offensive tackle that has seen very few snaps, if any, at Oregon over 2 years. He has the ability to come back due to the JUCO waiver. Does he come back to school? He said he'd like to, but is that, again, I'm going to say the part out loud that we probably shouldn't, is that in the best interest of Oregon for him to come back? Probably, maybe, I don't know. The only kind of consistent we know is Poncho at center. And then everybody else, it's up in the air. Dave Ayuli's back. They've added a couple portal additions here, which I think tells us Isaiah World and Alex Harkey. I think that tells us kind of the probability of Connolly going is probably kind of high.
Yeah, I'm kind of expecting that. I included Connolly in the 2 deep because, again, I was basically operating under the expectation or the assumption that if you haven't announced yet, we'll just keep you on the list. Once you do announce, we'll take you off. And, ultimately, I think he'll probably be in the 25 draft. And I think he's somebody who'll go in the first 2 or 3 rounds and probably have a great NFL career. Strangely undersized. I think people forget who I was talking about. Somebody was like, oh, he's got great tackle size. I'm like, he's 6'4", 305. Like that's like more like built like a guard, maybe not broad enough to be a guard. So be very curious to see what that looks like. But either way, supreme athlete and somebody who I just think got better and better during his time in Oregon. But I would be curious to see kind of where his draft stock ends up. But assuming he's not on the team, I actually think this is like pretty straightforward. Like I might look crazy, but I think you go World at left tackle, you got Iuli at left guard, Poncho at center. Bedford, assuming the waiver gets cleared, and Jared had a nice little story up on the site, I think on Monday, with an interview with Matthew from his time down at Media Day, just kind of talking about where his head was at. And then Alex Harkey at right tackle, with Kavika Rogers and Janoris Wilson being kind of your off the bench players to utilize with some frequency as kind of your swing players there. I think you feel pretty decent about that. You got to hope you hit on both these portal tackles. Oregon was really strong at tackle for the most part this year. I know the final game was not the case and maybe leaves a little bit of a sour taste, but all in all, Connolly was a first-team all-conference player. Cornelius is somebody who we saw over the course of his career play really well for the most part, and you got to hope World and Harkey are able to kind of carry that mantle. I think they're going to be perfectly fine in the interior. I thought Poncho had a season where he just got better and better. It was never going to be Wilmington Trophy like JPJ in first year. That was always kind of too high of a bar to set. But Poncho was, I think, PFF's third ranked or graded player at the position in the Big Ten this year. Somebody who I think has a chance to be an all-conference caliber player next year. I think you feel good about that. And frankly, I kind of liked what we saw from Dave Iuli for the most part. So I feel decent about this group. I don't think it's necessarily got the NFL draft talent unless World really develops that way that you saw this past season or in the past couple of seasons. But it's certainly not a group that I look at and go like, oh boy, this scares me.
Dave was as good as Harper this season. I'm not going to say he was better, but I felt like there wasn't a ton of drop off there. And so that's a positive for you, is that you get a junior who can at least be the equal potentially to the departing starter in Marcus Harper. We'll see what they do in terms of going out and trying to find more. There's certainly names out there that they're circled with. The big one being Emmanuel Pregnon, an offensive lineman from USC, an interior guy, a guy that started his career at Wyoming, transferred to USC in 2023, won the job there as a guard, was pretty solid, pretty good, wasn't a home run threat to leave to the NFL. This season, he turned in an all-conference year, was in kind of the discussion for one of the better candidates for like an All-American spot at the guards position. He didn't win the award, but he was in that discussion, which tells you his level of play. He is now at the JUCO level. He's now in the portal. He was going to go to the NFL, pulled back. Oregon's circling here, and it would be a 1-year run. And maybe this is an indicator that Bedford's not all the way back yet, or maybe they just want to increase the talent level here. Probably that's the more likely scenario. But
sure, yeah,
we'll be curious to see if they add more guys from the portal to this group. There's not a lot of experience. It's going to be a new quarterback. You'd really like to have an experienced O-line with a new starting quarterback, or a new starting quarterback with an inexperienced line. Oregon's currently there's not a lot of experience, and there's not a lot of experience at the quarterback position. But what we'll say is Alik Terry has shown in his 2 years at Oregon, he can turn a veteran unit into a really special group that was already pretty special. He can also take an offensive line that's basically all new and turn those guys over into a really special group. His setup that he has along the offensive line is pretty impressive. So Alik Terry is probably up for the challenge for 2025 in the offensive line group.
He's had 2 groups that both been Joe Moore Award finalists. I don't believe the school had any Joe Moore Award finalists prior to that. So he's done, based upon that award solely, he's produced the 2 best offensive line groups the school's ever had in 2 seasons. I know that's not totally the case, but that's an indication, at least, of the caliber of coaching you get from him and the development.
All right. We'll be back later this week, hopefully with a wrap-up show on the 2024 season, kind of a look ahead to 2025 with Jared, Eric, and myself. We'll also dive into Jared's projected 2 deep on the defensive side of the football, and kind of the portal adds there, and kind of the portal departures, how that impacts things. And then we're going to continue monitoring portal activity. Who knows when the next commitment could come? It could be today, to be honest. And we'll continue to monitor that as well as other recruiting on the site forduckterritory.com. But until the next one, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles Podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.